Hi, I'm Tammy Potter, and welcome to the Pregnancy Process Podcast, a show designed to help you navigate the hugely transformative journey to motherhood, where you'll hear the unique experience of experts in this area and the incredible stories of women sharing their conception, pregnancy, and postnatal journeys so that you can have a healthier, more informed pregnancy. In today's episode, I talked to former UK Member of Parliament and the architect of Britain's first ever parliamentary inquiry into birth trauma, Theodora Clarke. Theodora's story begins with a harrowing experience in a UK maternity ward, a story that tragically is far more common than we talk about. Drawing from her own journey of survival, loss, and recovery, she's become a leading voice in challenging the silence and stigma surrounding birth trauma and campaigning for systemic change in women's healthcare. Today, you'll hear firsthand about her battle to navigate a system that often leaves new mothers invisible. We'll discuss what truly needs to change in maternity care, the ripple effect of advocacy, and the power of honest conversation to create solidarity and hope for mothers everywhere. Theo, thank you so much for your time today. It's fantastic to have you here with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and what a pleasure to be joining an Australian podcast from the UK.
And I really appreciate it because I know that it's late over there. So I think the best place to start with us is the day of your daughter's actual birth. And if it's okay with you, I'd love for you to share what happened for you both physically and emotionally and how those moments change your understanding of childbirth.
So I had my daughter 2.5 years ago, and to be honest, it was my first baby. I didn't really have much expectations about what would happen, but I had very much expected my daughter to arrive around her due date, but she was 2 weeks late and ended up being induced. And I had very little understanding of what that process was. I got called into the hospital and I was there for several days being pumped every few hours with hormones to try and stimulate my body into having contractions. And that was really the start of really quite a stressful process. For the next 40 hours, I was in the hospital, and I'm afraid my daughter was extremely stubborn. She did not want to come out, and they ended up having to artificially break my waters. And then I ended up having an epidural. And eventually my daughter, after 40 hours of being in labour, did decide to join us. But what happened afterwards was that I had a postpartum hemorrhage. I actually got separated from my daughter. And instead of having that kind of wonderful golden hour that I'd been expected to bond with her and having her crawl up my chest and start to breastfeed, I actually got rushed into the emergency theatre in the UK and I got stitched up for over 2 hours. And at the time, I wasn't aware what had happened to me. But I later discovered I'd suffered from a very significant birth injury when she had come out, called a 3rd-degree tear. And to be honest, it was really terrifying, Tammy. I actually thought I was going to die when I was there in the hospital, and I thought I was never going to see my daughter again. But a really distressing time.
I'm really sorry to hear that. And I've actually done a whole podcast around induction, or specifically on the synthetic hormones called Pitocin that they use to induce contractions. And I know personally I've worked with women who've had their uterus torn in induction. So I'm so sorry that you've had to go through that. I think you've managed to turn something that was completely traumatic into something that's helping other women, which I think is so courageous. And I'm so sorry again. And in the aftermath of that, there definitely would have been some things that you would have had to process. If it's okay with you, can you talk about the emotions or challenges that you faced in the aftermath of that birth and how you actually began processing them?
To be honest, it was incredibly difficult. And I came out of surgery and I remember being put into a side room. And firstly, for several hours, I didn't see my daughter. No one told me where she was. And I actually thought that she died in that time. And I remember doing therapy later and a huge amount of grief came out that obviously I've been bottling up over the previous few months. But I think what really shocked me was I was in obviously an incredibly vulnerable and emotional state after just coming out of surgery. And I was actually awake on the operating table, so they wouldn't give me a general anaesthetic because I'd had an epidural. So can you imagine being awake in surgery? For me, it was like being in a war zone. I hadn't spent much time in hospital. And when I came out and was put in a room and I was reunited with my daughter, I was really receiving very poor care afterwards in the hospital. And I remember I was paralysed from the waist down. I had a drip in and I was really not in a good way. I couldn't look after myself, let alone my baby. And I remember pressing the emergency button for help. And Tamara, I was really shocked. This NHS professional in the UK hospital came in and said, "This is not my baby, not my problem." And she actually just walked out and left me there with my baby screaming in the cot several metres away from me. And it was really that experience that opened my eyes in the UK to really the lack of postnatal care in this country. So I think there's been a real focus traditionally on the kind of the pregnant mum and looking after us when we're pregnant. And then when you've just had the baby, everyone focuses on the baby. And it almost felt like we were not a patient anymore and that the hospital had completely forgotten that there was a second person in the room who'd given birth. And in my case, I really was not able to look after my baby. And I think we have these expectations in society that, you're going to have your maternity leave, you're going to be looking after your newborn. And in Britain, your husband only gets 2 weeks paternity leave and you just assume that will be fine and he'll go back to work. But no one really prepares you for what do you do in the situation where something goes wrong. So in my case, when I was finally discharged from hospital after nearly a week staying there, I actually couldn't look after my baby at all and we had to have extra help come in to help me. And it took me months to recover from the PTSD, from being in such an extreme environment, but also from living with a birth injury and very significant changes to my kind of mental and physical health on a day-to-day basis post-birth.
That phrase, "not my baby, not my problem," can I just ask a question? Have they found that person in the hospital that actually said that? Because that's so uncaring, and I can't believe that there would be someone on a maternity ward that would be so callous to a new mum who's had such a traumatic experience. Was there an inquiry at the hospital level around that? And I know I'm digressing a little bit, but I would like to think there was some type of inquiry and that person has been held responsible in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, so sadly, I did have to make a complaint to the hospital. And obviously, I was in a very unique situation, Tammy, because I was a member of parliament in the adjacent constituency. So I was actually able to meet with the chief executive of my hospital trust, with the chief midwifery officer, and very senior stakeholders in the hospital who did apologise. But really, that's what led me on the path to campaigning to improve maternity care, because I thought my story was probably quite unique and I was very unfortunate. But actually, what happened was I ended up meeting a charity called the Birth Trauma Association, and they introduced me to some other mums who came to see me in Parliament before I shared my story publicly. And I was really shocked to hear some of the stories about what had happened to them. And it was everything from babies that had died to babies that had had significant injuries to mums who'd had a fourth degree tear, not been able to go back to work, the whole remit of the types of things that could go wrong with birth complications. And to be honest, not something I knew much about at all before I started campaigning on this issue. And that was really what led me to start campaigning. And I thought very long and hard as a sitting politician in the House of Commons about whether I should talk about it very publicly. Because also, it's not just my story to tell, it's also my daughter's. And when she grows up, she'll obviously be very aware that I've publicly spoken so much about what happened to me. But I also thought it was really important because there seems to be a real stigma and a taboo about speaking about birth when something goes wrong. And back to my point about society expectations, I do think we have this kind of sort of expectation society that everything will be fine. If you get to go home with your healthy baby, you should be grateful. But actually, a lot of mums have had a really difficult time with their mental and physical health, and we don't seem to talk about it. And that's what I tried to do by standing up in the British Parliament and giving a speech about it, to say, this is what it's like. This is the reality for a mum who's had a really significant birth injury like myself. What are the symptoms? What's it like to live with it day to day? Because we don't talk about this stuff. It's just wiped under the carpet. And I really want to challenge people to say that's not okay. These mums need to have help, and governments around the world need to do more to help them in Australia, UK, and everywhere else.
It's interesting. I guess you've come at this from a different perspective. And even though we're not in the same fields, we're definitely working towards the same thing from different aspects. Because as a strength coach, I've worked with many women who have suffered from terrible traumatic birth injuries, even, bad abdominal separation, pelvic floor trauma. Like I've mentioned, I've had one client whose uterus ruptured because of the Pitocin induction being poorly prescribed, basically. And people ask why I do what I do, and I just know over the years, the more that I've learned about this journey that women go on, the more passionate I've become, which is why I've created the Pregnancy Process program, which helps educate women. And this is probably one of the reasons why I do the podcast as well, and have people like yourself on, and people like childbirth attorney Gina Mundi, where we did that Pitocin Paradox podcast. And what you're saying about the baby becoming the patient, and then again it's like that medicalization of the birth process. It's definitely, the more medicalized the birth process has become over the years, because it's so 50-50. There's been so many incredible advances in the birth process and C-sections and all that type of thing. But then at the same time, that more medicalized approach is definitely, I feel, part of the reason why we're seeing some of these traumas that we are seeing. And the baby becoming the patient is definitely part of that as well. But what moment made you realize that you needed to speak out about your experience? And kind of, obviously you've mentioned your daughter being aware of this when she's older, and I love that you even had that thought process. What other fears or hopes did you have about making your story public?
I remember the exact moment, Tammy, when I decided to do something about it, because to be honest, as a politician, I had not been a big campaigner on healthcare prior to this. I've been very much known for kind of foreign affairs and international relations. So I remember when I reached out to the Birth Trauma Association originally, they were quite surprised that as a backbench MP, I'd written to them. But I remember when I was meeting these mums and we had this town meeting where they shared their very personal stories. And I was just shocked to hear that they really weren't meeting with government ministers or senior accountable people in the Prime Minister's office that could actually affect change and improve care for mums. And they said, you're the only person who's listening and you're the only person who's invited us in to see you. So even though I wasn't a government minister, I really felt like I had that platform as a sitting member of parliament that I could go into the chamber and I could give a speech. And I remember when I gave my speech, it was the first debate in British history in our parliament on birth trauma. And first of all, doesn't that say so much, right? That in 1,000 years, there had never been a debate on this topic before until I led it in October of that year. And I think that firstly goes to demographic in parliament, that we just don't have enough women. And we certainly don't have enough women who are young mums like myself who are prepared to talk about it. And I remember it was a really quiet day in Parliament. It was on a Thursday. We had multiple by-elections. I wasn't expecting many people to be in the chamber. And the House of Commons chamber is a very intimidating place to speak. You're standing in this grand sort of chamber of history where Winston Churchill went to war and Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister and all these great figures in history. And it's quite a scary place to stand up in front of the world's cameras and to speak about something so incredibly personal. And what ended up happening was I started to share my story. And very unexpectedly, Tammy, I actually burst into tears. So this is live on TV in the UK Parliament, which was very unexpected. And it got clipped by the BBC. And by the time I'd come out of giving my speech, it had actually gone everywhere and it had just gone viral on social media. I think because it was so unusual to have a member of Parliament speaking about something so incredibly personal. Obviously, I got very emotional during my speech, and I was quite lucky that another very senior MP interrupted me and gave me time to have a kind of glass of water and kind of calm down a bit to finish my speech. And I think what I found so emotional was, firstly, the trauma is still there. It was trapped in my body even a year later, that I hadn't processed what had happened to me. But also, which you couldn't see on the camera, but sat upstairs in the gallery, I actually had loads of mums who'd come to watch me, who'd been supporting my campaign and had written to me with their stories, as well as my husband. And I think back to your point, I really felt that weight of responsibility. Like I was the politician that had taken the time to meet with them, that had taken the time to hear their stories. And we suddenly had this opportunity to have this debate. And the Women's Health Minister was sat in front of me and she was listening and she was going to have to respond on behalf of the government of what they were going to do. And that was really the start of a campaign to improve care, because what I discovered was that when I shared my story, basically overnight, I suddenly got inundated with thousands of families writing to me with incredibly similar stories. And that's what led me to go on to start the birth trauma inquiry in the UK Parliament and to start collecting evidence. Very similar, in fact, to the New South Wales inquiry, which you had in your select committee in your Parliament. And that was very much an inspiration for our own back in the UK.
Even just sitting here hearing you talk about this, I feel emotional thinking about not only what you've gone through, but the fact that you've really taken that on. And I thank you so much on behalf of all women for doing the work that you're doing. And is there something that you wish more people understood about the lasting impact of birth trauma on mental health, and how is your advocacy hoping that we can better support women in their recovery?
I think that's exactly the point, Tammy. So if I look at myself as a new mum, I actually did take the time to go to antenatal classes in the UK with my husband for several weeks. And I can say it was very good from the perspective of meeting other mums, someone you can send a WhatsApp at 3 a.m. to ask them a question about feeding or struggling to go to sleep with your baby. But to be honest, I was really told absolutely nothing about risks in childbirth, and to start to prepare that in the unfortunate event that something went wrong, what do you want to happen in that scenario? These are the types of things that could happen. And I remember I was looking at my old notes when I was writing my book, Breaking the Taboo. And some of the notes said things like bring your Spotify playlist, bring your fairy lights. That's basically what I was told to bring in my hospital bag. And no one sat down and took the time to explain that anything else could go wrong. And I caveat that by saying a lot of people listening to a podcast will have a very good experience in pregnancy and they will have a happy, healthy baby, which they go home with. But I suppose what I'm interested in is that there is this proportion of people like myself, and we might be a small proportion of the public who give birth every year, but we will go on to develop either physical or mental problems post-birth. And why is it that we don't talk about that? And if we don't talk about it, then mums won't know that this is a problem and know how to get help afterwards. But also there's the wider problem with my kind of former politician hat on, which is then government doesn't take action to do anything about it. So what I discovered in the UK, and we had 1,300 families that wrote to us to give evidence with really shocking stories of poor care, and not just in certain geographical areas in Britain, but actually right the way across the country. And it became really clear to me that there was very sadly a postcode lottery in the UK in terms of maternity care. And that's, I think, the injustice that I found just really shocking, was that depending on actually where you give birth in Britain, you will receive a different level of care depending on your hospital trust. And in the UK, we love to refer to the kind of the National Health Service, but I actually discovered it's not national and it's not a standardised maternity package. So I wrote this big report over 4 months, and we took evidence from the public and from healthcare professionals and other family members. And we came up with a very concrete 80-page proposal to the Prime Minister, which I presented to him, and it had more than 40 policy recommendations of how to improve care. And our headline one, which I think is applicable really to every country around the world, including Australia, is to have a standardised maternity care package. I just don't think it's acceptable that depending on where you live, you will receive a different level of care as a new mum. And especially when something goes wrong, like it did with me, to make sure that the aftercare is there, because I just don't think that it's good enough at the moment to what we currently have.
Even when you compare the French, I'm just talking about pelvic floor here and specialist women's health physios. When you look at countries like France, their just standard level of care is that every woman who gives birth goes to a specialist women's health physio, irrespective of what their journey has been like. Where here in Australia, we don't have that. And for some women, accessing specialist women's health physios is just not economically possible for them, which makes me really sad, because for me, I feel like that's the gold standard level of care. They need to be in the specialist women's health physio during their pregnancy. They need to do birth prep with the specialist women's health physio. And we know that being educated around your options, women are always going to have better outcomes when they are educated around the different options and the different paths and things that can happen. And I know that there are definitely people here advocating for specialist women's health physios to be part of women's journeys. And I don't want to go down the path of gender here and race here, but we also know that race absolutely comes into it. And I'm sure you would have seen that in your inquiry. And I know that it happens here. And how women are treated depending on their race comes into it as well, which just breaks my heart. And then, of course, there absolutely has to be some gender issues in here as well. This wouldn't be happening if it was men going through this, but I think it's great that we're finally, as women, standing up and being like, this can't continue to happen, because I'm sure our mothers, like how many mothers have said that was just what women put up with as a price of
Mm,
childbirth. And I've certainly had women that have had significant birth trauma. I've worked with them going into doctors' surgeries because their pelvic floor symptoms have gotten significantly worse after having a cold. And the doctor
mm,
has turned around and just been like, that's just what it's going to be like for you. And the
mm,
damage that has done to their mental health and the setbacks that they've suffered from being treated like that in a doctor's surgery, it was major. They'd had such incredible progress. And then to have a setback like that, just from a cold and a cough, and going to a doctor, a GP, and being like, listen, this is what's happening. I'm unwell. It's having this impact. And them just dismissing those symptoms. It's sad. It breaks my heart. So again, I guess that we need more people advocating like what you're doing.
mm. I totally agree with everything you just said. And we actually called our report in the UK Listen to Mums, Ending the Postcode Lottery and Perinatal Care, for exactly that point. And we actually wrote a whole chapter about inequalities in care, because in the UK it's actually 5 times more likely as a black mum that you're going to die or have significant issues in childbirth, and 3 times more likely if you're a South Asian woman. And unfortunately, we do have issues with racism in the NHS in the UK, and some of the language that healthcare professionals have used to mums is completely unacceptable. And the other thing that we wrote a chapter about was we started to look at different countries around the world and compared how they do look after mums post-birth. And I'm interested that you just mentioned about France, because I find it riveting that our next door neighbour has a very different approach to health for new mums. And why is it that in the UK and other countries that we don't offer the same level of pelvic health? And you talked there about mums going on to develop issues in the longer term. Things like the menopause, we know, can impact on birth injuries, having significant symptoms worsen as you get older. None of that stuff is taught to us about by local doctors and NHS midwives. And I hope by me talking about it and others, that it actually is starting to have a national conversation in the UK about these are the things that could happen. And actually, if mothers have a better sense when they go into birth about things that could go wrong or what they'd like to happen, then actually it will reduce the birth trauma in the first place.
Let's talk a little bit about your public advocacy, seeing we're moving into that now. What did you discover about the scale and the causes and the issues that you're facing in the UK?
To be honest, so many. The headline point was about this postcode lottery,
Mm.
that services were not standardised. But there were so many points of failure in the system where new mums were not being looked after. And I remember being really struck by one academic who gave a quote to the inquiry, and she said that being a pregnant mum was a bit like being a sweet in a wrapper. And we eat the sweet and then we just throw the wrapper away. And in this scenario, the mum is the wrapper post-birth. And I thought, do you
Mm.
know what? That's actually a very good analogy for really how we treat people in terms of policy. So we came up with a number of very particular recommendations for the UK context of how to improve care. And we had quite a bit of success with getting the previous Prime Minister in the UK to adopt those. And one of the ones I'm particularly pleased about, which I campaigned on myself, was about the GP appointment. So in the UK, at sort of 6 weeks post-birth, you will be invited to see your GP, hopefully. And in that appointment, you traditionally just got asked about your baby. And I remember when I had my appointment, I think it was 10 minutes. My baby was absolutely fine, by the way. She had no issues post-birth whatsoever. And at the very end of the 10 minutes appointment, I was asked, do you have postnatal depression? Yes or no? And by the way, you have 1 minute left. And even though I had a significant birth injury, it was not even in their file. Their notes weren't even shared, even though it was 12 miles between the hospital and my doctor's surgery in the same constituency. And I just found that astonishing that the mum was really just being discounted in terms of care post birth. And so, even though I really was the patient, right, that needed to have help and was having specialist care for recovery from my stitches and my birth injury for months after birth, and I have to be referred to a specialist service for my mental health. Everything was really focused on my baby. Even things like small appointments in the first couple of days were for her to check things like the heel prick test, and no one would even look at my stitches. So we had quite a big campaign in the UK to change that. And I'm so pleased that the Prime Minister previously did announce in the UK that we will actually now have a GP checkup appointment for the mum's physical and mental health as well as the baby. So even if that was the one change that we got in our campaign alongside others, that is a huge difference, that all the mums coming after me will now actually be asked. And if they get asked, they're more likely to talk about it. If they talk about it, they're more likely to be signposted to help to do something about it. So I'm so pleased that the government did take action on that.
And what can I ask what the other significant points that came up for you in that inquiry were?
Yeah, so many. I mean, we had about 40 recommendations, of which sort of 12 were headline. The first was to have a national maternity improvement strategy to have better joined up services. And then we had very specific things on lots of different topics. So we had so many stories with very similar themes that came through. We had mums being denied pain relief during labour because they weren't being listened to. We had some really shocking testimony from dads where they basically weren't spoken to at all during labour and were basically treated as a kind of second class citizen. I remember one dad gave very harrowing evidence, and he said to me that when something went wrong, he was basically only spoken to once and told, "Do you want to save your wife or your child?" And they didn't even address him by name. And I just found that absolutely shocking. That's the way that someone like in that very distressing circumstances would be treated. And unfortunately, this was a kind of pattern of behaviour. It wasn't an isolated incident in one particular hospital. And unfortunately, in Britain, we've had now a number of investigations into failing hospital trusts. In the adjacent hospital to my own constituency in Shrewsbury and Telford, we had a number of babies that died from avoidable deaths, and there were cover-ups by the hospital staff. So we've had to have quite a big, frank look in the UK at maternity services. And why is it that the care is just simply not adequate or not up to scratch? So we had a kind of long list of things that we thought the government should do. But also, I think on a really basic level, it's down to funding and staffing. I remember on the night that I gave birth, it was a busy Saturday on an August bank holiday weekend, and there just clearly were not enough people on the ward. And we've got to have governments around the world investing in frontline services. We need to have more midwives, more obstetricians, more anaesthetists, more people actually on the ward who can be looking after mums. And that's why I've been expanding my campaign to go global, because the last 2 years have been very much focused about the NHS in the UK. But other mums have started writing to me from around the world, and I included several in my book that came out a few weeks ago, including a mum from Australia who wrote her very sad story down, because I really wanted to make the point that giving birth is one of the few things that happens globally and impacts on every country around the world. And actually, level of care in many countries is not good for mums post birth. So that's why I've set up the Global Birth Trauma Alliance to try and do something about it, and to really build a kind of coalition of politicians like myself who really care and want to champion and advocate for this, because ultimately it does come down to governments deciding to prioritise funding for maternity care and also prioritising it as a policy area. And I think if we have more politicians like myself talking about this, then as you said at the beginning, Tammy, then we'll have women's health being a bigger priority area and not being ignored like it has been in comparison to men's health.
Interestingly, when we talk about this, a statistic popped in my head about how 1% of the NHS funding, 1% goes towards menopause research. And you think about menopause happens to 100% of
Yeah,
50% of our population. I'm going to
very
start
much.
getting close. When I hear things like this, I get so angry because it's not good enough. And when you look at the funding, I understand that's something that needs to change on a, like you're saying, global level. But even globally, when you look at birth, 80% of women give birth. That's 80% of 50% of the population go through
Mhm.
this. And this just comes back to that same point. If this was, and I've seen memes about this as well, if this was happening to men, the difference would be astronomical. So it really comes back to that gender inequality.
No, I totally agree with you. And I remember when I was an MP at the time, I remember seeing the Women's Health Strategy being published. And I went to get a copy in the library and started reading it ahead of a debate. And I think I just assumed that it was an annual publication. And then I remember the librarian in our parliament saying to me, no, this is the very first time ever in British history that a women's health strategy had been published. And I was absolutely taken aback. And I thought that just explains so much, is that we just don't have enough legislators who have the life experience of being a young mum and are prepared to talk about this and talk about women's health. And I do think the fact that we don't have gender parity in Parliament is part of the problem, because as you said, we're 51% of the population, but we're certainly not 50% in every parliament around the world, and we're still much in the minority. And I think you've got to change and modernise Parliament for young families in order for that to change.
Do you know, I'm a New Zealander. I live in Australia, but I'm a New Zealander. And it just makes me think about Jacinda Ardern when she had her baby. And I think you were elected to Parliament. There is a bit of an alignment there, where that you were elected to Parliament while navigating new motherhood and recovering from birth trauma. That would have created in itself its own kind of like juggling act. In terms of that, how did balancing those roles influence your advocacy, and what challenges did that bring? I think that's probably more the point that I want to talk about, is the, because we know about where it took you in terms of advocacy. What challenges did that bring in terms of juggling life at that point?
To be honest, it was incredibly difficult. And it's interesting you mentioned about your former Prime Minister in New Zealand, because she's just been in the UK actually on her book tour talking about her experience as a new mum and a world leader. And it was very interesting hearing what she had to say about how she really was trying to hide that she was pregnant and having morning sickness symptoms, because it was seen as getting in the way of the job, and she didn't want to be seen as a kind of weak female leader. And I felt very similar. I didn't talk about my story for nearly a year until I came back, because I did feel like it was going to interfere with me doing the job and people feeling not competent. And because you have so many issues going on with your mental and physical health, do people think that you're able to do the job you're elected to do? And I think it's a really unusual context being a sitting politician, because basically in any other job, if I was, chief exec of a charity, you'd have an acting CEO who'd probably come and cover you for 6 months post-birth. But I was in basically the only job in the country where we're actually not legally entitled to normal statutory maternity leave. And the reason for that is that we have no designated legal representative. So it puts us in a very difficult situation, because there was basically no real allowances made. I think really the only thing they'd thought about in advance was about our voting. So I did have what's called a proxy vote for 6 months, and that meant that I could vote remotely and I didn't have to go down to London, which made a huge difference. And there were so many other things I wasn't able to do. So one of the most important things you can do as an MP is obviously to hold the government to account and to stand up in the Parliament and to ask questions of the Prime Minister and government ministers. And especially when there were issues affecting my local constituency, I didn't feel well enough to go and do that, and no one else could do it in my stead. And I actually ended up writing a whole chapter in my memoir, quite unexpectedly, about modernising Parliament, for that very reason, that because we don't talk about it, and there are very few women who've given birth whilst elected. So I was only the 56th MP in British history to have a baby whilst elected as a sitting MP. So it's still incredibly unusual. And they also don't make many allowances. I remember I wrote about having very bad morning sickness, which I think all mums will relate. It's all morning and night sickness. It's certainly not just breakfast time. And we had a really late evening vote at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I was vomiting so badly, I actually couldn't go into the chamber to vote. And I had to lie down in a room nearby. And the government wouldn't send me home. They said, you've got to be here. We've got to defend the government's vote tonight, and you've got to vote. And any other workplace, that would be completely unacceptable, to keep a heavily pregnant mum back at work at 1 o'clock in the morning. And that was just considered standard and normal. And that's partly why I decided to call it out, because if people like myself don't, then it means the next generation of women coming in after me will have very similar challenges. But I hope that it means that they will think second and long and hard about whether mums should be in that situation, and they should be sending them home and looking after them.
I really feel like there is a wave of women. I think part of it is because we now have a platform to talk about things through, for all its flaws, social media has now become a platform where we are now more globally connected, and women are now having these platforms that they probably didn't have access to previously. And it's allowing us to advocate for women coming up under us. And I'm sure if the women before us had this kind of platform, they probably would have been doing this as well. But just makes me think of another guest that I've had on this podcast, and she works in the coaching sphere. And she was back at work after giving birth, and she was still breastfeeding her baby, and she was in a male locker room, I think, and there was a tour around the facility of school children, and they basically opened the door to her breastfeeding in this male locker room because there was nowhere for her to breastfeed. Or I think maybe at one point she was put into a cupboard somewhere or something like that.
I relate so much to what you're saying, and it just reminded me, the other thing that I found very difficult was because I'd had such a significant birth injury. I actually spent the first 2 weeks basically in bed, and I couldn't even go downstairs. I basically could only go to the loo and back. And the only thing that I thought about was basically access to the toilet because I couldn't control my bowels. So imagine being a member of parliament where people expect you to be out and about. Everybody knows who you are. I lived in my constituency. Going to shop in the supermarket was then suddenly a huge deal for me, and I didn't feel like I could leave the house. And I think something that we really don't talk about enough is the symptoms that mums live with post-birth. And I used to think about getting on the train, where would be toilet stops, about getting in the car, would I be stuck in traffic? All of these little really basic things, but that really affect your day-to-day life. Wearing dark clothes and black legging pants, and wanting to put on a dress and a light colour in case you had something to stain because you were bleeding so heavily post-birth. And these are all the things that you also don't feel that you can talk to people about. And then I was a member of the government at the same time, so it was like additionally challenging because I was really never off in the entire time that I was looking after my baby, even though I was really not in a fit state to do.
It almost feels it's set up to exclude women from parliament. The framework of it excludes women from participating in it.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think they really need to change and modernise Parliament as a workplace. I found it extraordinary, firstly, that as a politician and a lawmaker, I used to vote on legislation for things like maternity leave in the workplace, which would apply to businesses, but then ironically didn't apply to ourselves. And I think they really do need to look at things like late night voting hours. Why is it that we had electronic voting, for example, during the pandemic, or we had the ability to ask virtual questions in the Chamber of Ministers? All things which should be hugely helpful to a mum with a newborn baby, and that we don't have to do the huge amount of travelling from our district back and forth to the Parliament. And I think the honest answer is back to your point, Tammy, that there aren't enough senior women elected officials who are sitting on these committees, deciding on these structures. And Parliament was set up, by men for men, and I don't think they'd ever envisaged that someone like me, who is a kind of younger female MP with a newborn baby, would ever be sitting as a member of Parliament. So that needs to change.
And I think that brings us full circle back to a point that I made previously about the medicalisation of birth. Because if you look at when the medicalisation of birth happened, who was in charge then? So it was mainly men that were obstetricians back then, because back then women weren't able to even go to university to become doctors. And this is where, and sadly, a lot of the things that were in place back then, and obviously that things have changed a little bit, but there are some things that they're still doing in the birthing process, and that cascade of interventions that we talked about right at the beginning of the podcast. There are things that are being done to women that have been done to them for hundreds of years, probably like since the 1800s when birth started to become medicalized. So it's interesting. And even just your point about Jacinda Ardern being a weak female leader and hiding her symptoms. Do you know how prevalent that is in the employment space for women, that they feel like they're being judged on the fact that they're pregnant, so they hide it. They feel like they're going to be seen like they're not doing their job properly, so they hide their pregnancy, or they work 10 times harder. And I guess this is just unearthing. This conversation is unearthing this is like a tentacle of a bigger core issue, is that women just aren't being supported correctly through this transformative journey that every single woman has to go through in order to move the population forwards. If women stop giving birth, then what's going to happen? Where the
Mm,
population is going to die. And it's in every single sector. When you look at the impact to a woman's career, her financial prospects, like giving birth is
mm.
such a significant hindrance to that. And so it's one tentacle of a bigger core issue, is that women just aren't being supported in this modern world through this process well enough.
I completely agree. And I think we talk a lot about the motherhood penalty and how,
Yes.
being a mum means it impacts us in your career. But I think the piece that we've been missing is more about the recovery post birth. And I think there's been such a fixation on social media of people posting pictures of themselves on Instagram or X of kind of their body bouncing back from birth, and really things that I think set really unrealistic expectations for mum of what it's like. As I described, all I was thinking about was where's the nearest toilet, and I could barely look after myself, let alone my daughter. And the thought of going to the gym or worrying about losing body weight post birth, those things were absolutely not even on my radar. I was just purely focused on surviving and getting through the day. And I think that goes back to my point about why I've been talking about this, which is the importance of the antenatal education, because I just want mums to be better informed. I don't want to scare anyone who's giving birth. And as I said, many of you will have, do want mums to be better informed so that in the event that something does go wrong, you have more informed consent and you can make a decision of your body and what you want to do. And it's so important that we have these conversations.
Absolutely. And I know that you're starting to go into that more international advocacy. And if you want to talk a little bit about your book as well, because you've mentioned
Mm,
that a couple of times, I'd love to hear
yeah.
a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I decided to write my story down. Firstly, because so many people kept asking me what had happened to me. I decided to write my memoir earlier this year, which was just published in the UK in May. But also, it was to start a national conversation about birth trauma, which hopefully I start as a politician, but I'm continuing outside of Parliament because there's really so little books in the UK about this topic. I remember going into kind of my local bookshop, and I think everything in the section on pregnancy was on, home births or week by week pregnancy guides, or there'd be stuff on kind of weaning my baby and sleep training. And I remember looking for a book for myself, a mum who'd been through a difficult time, and I really couldn't find anything to read or anything I could relate to. And what's been really interesting about reading the feedback from mums who've read my book is that it has started to build that community and to help them to feel less alone. Because I think when you've had a really difficult birth, you think that you're the only person in the world this has happened to and it's awful. But actually, I find that peer support point of speaking to somebody else who's had a very similar experience to yourself is incredibly helpful. And hopefully, other mums who've read my book now feel less alone, but have also hopefully been signposted to better resources. And then I also included a whole chapter about how to improve the NHS because let's be frank, the government hasn't accepted all of our recommendations from the birth trauma inquiry. And I think it's really important that they do announce them. And we had our health secretary just in the last few weeks announce a national investigation into maternity. So I really hope that he implements the recommendations from our inquiry, given we heard from more than 1,000 families.
That's amazing. And you mentioned bounce back culture before, and that is
Mm,
something that I just hate it. I hate bounce back culture so much when it comes to women and pregnancy because it's a metamorphosis. And this is what I talk about in my program, in my community, with my clients all the time. It's a transition, and you're never going to be the person that you were prior to
mm,
having children. And it's a really beautiful opportunity for you to think about who you want to become as you step into a new version of yourself. And it's not about going back to who you were before because you're never going to be the person that you were before. And that bounce back culture is part of that because it gives that
mm,
backwards nature, name, everything, like going back to who you were before. You're not going to be the person that you were before. You're a new version of yourself. You've stepped through the fire of becoming a mother. Because at the same time, and I've spoken about this so many times with many people on this podcast, is that when a baby is birthed, so too is a mother, and you're not the
mm,
same person. Of course, there are parts of you that are going to be the same, but it's a really beautiful opportunity for you to choose the parts of you that you want to leave back there prior to becoming a mother and the parts of you that you want to bring forwards. And I think you can see it as that opportunity to reinvent yourself rather than actually thinking about, hey, I want to go back to who I was before. You can't put the baby back in. Like, if you know, like, you can't reverse
And then
time.
yeah, no, you're so right. And I think we need to challenge society expectations and say that that shouldn't be the culture and the normal, because it means that women have these completely unrealistic expectations of what happened to their body post birth. And I was speaking to a mum just this week in the UK who'd had major reconstruction surgery, and she was saying how she didn't feel like a woman anymore because she'd had so many changes to her anatomy. And then I've had several mums that I've met who've had stoma bags, where because their birth injuries have been so severe, they've actually had to take the decision that they're not going to be able to basically go to the toilet naturally ever again, and they've had to have a stoma fitted. And I find that extraordinary. That's something that they knew nothing about before this happened to them, and it's going to impact and affect them for the rest of their lives. And that's why I've been campaigning so hard for governments to do something about this, because we don't talk about this enough. There is not enough investment. There are not enough policy changes from the governments around the world. And this is not just from in the UK, but this is globally. And I included in my book stories from mums around the world in countries as far afield as Yemen and in Sierra Leone and in places like Australia, because I also wanted to make the point that you might be a refugee in a camp, or you might be living in a really developed country like Britain, but actually women are facing the same problems, which is that they're not being listened to and they're not being given the help and the care that they need post-birth. And frankly, that needs to change. And I hope that governments take action.
Thank you. And I completely agree with that. And again, I thank you so much for the work that you're doing for all women around the world. And if there was one thing that you wish all women knew before having a baby, what would that be?
I think for me, it's just knowing your options. I always use the phrase of, I think my birth plan went out the window, but I think having more of a birth preferences is always useful to have. And I think it's just being more aware of, if something goes wrong, what do you want to happen? Like, I'll give you an example of friends who had their baby that ended up being premature and going to NICU. And she wished she discussed with her husband, do I want you to stay with me or with the baby in that scenario when the baby's taken to a different unit in a different part of the hospital? And I think when you're in like a kind of extreme emergency scenario, like with me having the hemorrhage and being rushed into surgery, those are not the right times to be having a really frank conversation with your partner or with your family or advocating for yourself, because you're in such extreme distress. So I think if you can have those conversations before, because you've been better educated as a new mum about what might happen, then I think you'll probably have a better outcome. And we do know that mums who know more are also less likely to suffer from birth trauma. And many of the reasons they've gone on to develop mental health symptoms, like myself, is because they weren't being listened to and they didn't know what was happening. They felt completely out of control. And I went on to develop things like perinatal OCD, because clearly my body was in shock at what had happened to me, and that was a way of controlling my environment. So I really feel for anyone listening to today who's had a similar experience. And I just really advise them to get help. There's some fantastic charities that we work with, like Birth Trauma Association or MASIC, who are really specialist on kind of mental health or birth injuries. And I think my main message would be, don't be suffering in silence. Do ask for help. There is no shame. If something has happened to you in birth, it's happened to you, not because of you. And there are some really good services out there to help you get better. And look how much better I am. My daughter's now nearly 3, and I've really learned to live and recover so much better from what happened to me. So even though I had incredibly traumatic experience when she arrived, I'm in such a better place because I had help. And that would be really my main message, is to ask for it.
And before we finish off here, it's interesting. I've just recently had 2 incredible women on the podcast that do EMDR, which is a form of trauma therapy. And one of the guests, she was doing EMDR for Indigenous women around the perinatal experience. There's definitely people out there that can help you process the trauma. And for those that don't know what EMDR is, it is actually a form of trauma processing that you can do in therapy. So there's definitely people out there that can help. And Theo, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for sharing your story. And I just think what you're doing is so incredible to help women that have come after you and that have gone through this experience. So thank you for your time today. I do really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk.
And if you're hearing this message, I want to say a huge thank you, because it means that you've listened to this entire episode. Of course, if you have any questions about the things that we covered in this episode, or want to know more about me or my other projects, you can find me on YouTube and Instagram at The Pregnancy Process.